When you think about graveyard strategies in Commander, what comes to mind? You might think about self-mill, you might think about some sort of sacrifice effects with reanimation, you might even think about trying to exile or mill your entire library in order to win with a Labman combo. You might think about cards like Tarmogoyf that get bigger based on your graveyard. You might think about having Gerard, some sort of sacrifice engine that wants cards to be in the graveyard, bring it back, and have some payoffs with things being in your graveyard. In most cases, I would agree with you, but I think I would like to take it one step forward. Most people probably think it's a graveyard strategy. You need to have black. But this is where us as deck builders need to expand our brains just a little bit further. While yes, black does have the most payoffs, it's also really obvious and pretty generic after quite a few playthroughs. But what if I told you we could make a deck that not only utilizes the graveyard effectively, but actively uses your entire library, and every single card is meant to serve a single purpose. That purpose being to fill the graveyard, pay off from things being in your graveyard, exile cards out of your graveyard to pay some costs, get bigger based on your graveyard, cheat out cost based off of graveyard, have lands enter from your graveyard, and just have every little bit of the deck serve that single purpose. In the past, we've talked about having very high synergy decks and how we can do so. There is no difference in this kind of deck that we are trying to put out. However, I challenged myself to not use the color black no matter what. It all came to me on one fateful night. As most Magic players do, we lay there in our beds at midnight thinking to ourselves, what can I do next? What can I build that is different than the rest of them? Some might be thinking about past trauma. I am thinking about new Magic the Gathering decks. And on this fateful night, I thought to myself, Oculus, fear of missing out, faithless looting. These cards are iconic in 60 card formats that also utilize the graveyard. You wouldn't necessarily consider them graveyard decks, but they do utilize their graveyard just as much as some of these other graveyard decks do. In both modern and standard, there are decks that like to utilize discarding effects, graveyard effects, to not only cheat out cost, cheat out creatures, or use Delve in order to help out their late game prowess. Hogak is a huge example of this, but I also want to stay away from Hogak because Hogak uses black. Having cards like Vengevine and Hollow One are essential to decks like this. Play something like a Faithless Looting, get to play a Hollow One for free. Play something like a Burning Inquiry, get to play Hollow One for free. Cast a bunch of madness creatures like Blazing Rootwalla, and get that Vengevine out really early. Now in Standard it's a little bit different. In Standard you're using cards like Kiora, Fear of Missing Out, and other can-tripping effects in order to fill your graveyard so that you can either reanimate with Helping Hand and Abhorrent Oculus, or be able to exile 6 cards from your graveyard and cast your Abhorrent Oculus that way. This card is absolutely insane, and it uses so many other cards in just a synergistic way that you wouldn't necessarily consider a graveyard deck, but it utilizes its graveyard just enough that I probably would consider it one. There are decks in Standard that run Graveyard Hate, not only to deal with things like Omniscience, but that can also deal with cards like Abhorrent Oculus because of their power. But we're getting a little bit caught up now. We're talking more about 60 card formats when we are a Commander deck building channel. How can we utilize these effects to their fullest? And how can we make a deck around this when we are limited to Singleton? A lot of these decks work so well and so consistently because you're able to have up to 4 copies of each of these cards. So in a color like white, when all you really need is Helping Hand, a source of removal, and maybe a board wipe, that's totally fine. But in a format like Commander, white is not quite sufficient enough for a full graveyard strategy, especially if you're only in Jeskai. Of course, you could make something like that work, but in this instance, I chose to steer away from it. Next is black. The reason we use black so often in graveyard strategies is because the amount of support that it has, both from dice triggers, the amount of reanimation spells that come from it, and just the overall power of using your graveyard is a lot more supported in that color. But again, we don't necessarily want to be a stereotypical self-mill graveyard deck. We want to have active threats at all given times that have just enough synergy that they can kind of come together and create a cohesive unit. So back to my story, I was up late at night conjuring up a deck. I thought to myself, we'll need cards that are able to cantrip us that are also on creatures. Cards like the new Tursa Light Shatter, Kiora the Rising Tide, Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel, Fear of Missing Out, and Abhorrent Oculus, along with older cards like Riel the Everwise, Brawlin Sky Shark Rider, Dig Through Time, Dragon Rage Chandler, and of course, cards like Faithless Looting. Now, we're using a lot of these cards in a almost tempo style deck. We want to actively be playing a threat every single turn that's allowing us to dig through our deck while also feeding our graveyard for some of our late game finishers. We're okay with discarding a lot of cards because we run flashback creatures, we run delve creatures, we have plenty of cards that reduce their cost based on your graveyard. We even use some niche effects and mechanics like Collect Evidence, Dredge, Delve, and Eternalize for some of our cards. I wanted to use these cards to the best of their abilities. The reason I decided to substitute white for green is mostly because green has a more creature-focused strategy in general in Commander, as well as the fact that green still has quite a bit of graveyard help and can help us with ramp. We can be a little bit more focused on our land base with cards like Azusa, Lumra, Bonnie Paul, Satyr Wayfinder, and Splendid Reclamation. Because we have a lot of land recursion, we're actually okay with discarding these lands often in order to help dig for more gas. A card like Molt Tinder is probably going to be the best and only mana dork that we really need, allowing us to utilize some of those cards that aren't going to actually help us get further into our game plan to help add mana, or to at least help us consistently mill a single card every turn. So this is a Temur deck. Red, blue, and green. It's quite the interesting color combo for a graveyard strategy. What kind of commander are we looking to run with a strategy like this? Well, after looking, I thought initially to think about playing some partner commanders. Partner commanders can be fun because they are broad and generic and would most likely be able to help you figure out or pay off your strategies a lot more. My first choice was a really weird pairing of Jeska, Kaidel. The reason we want Kaidel is because we can add a lot of mana to our mana pool since we are cantripping a lot in a deck like this. And then Jeska can not only amplify some of our damage on our creatures, but can also help control the board the more and more we cast her. However, I decided this was a little bit too complicated and it probably would just be a little bit too clunky for a deck like this. So I decided to go with Borborygmos and Fipplethip. Now, the reason we like Borborygmos and Fipplethip is that it is a 6/5 creature, which is just a really good statted creature on a 5-mana card. It also has upside that allows us to draw a card every single time it enters or attacks, and then we can discard our lands. Allowing us to be a draw engine and a discard outlet in a single card is something that we really like. And we don't really care about discarding our lands, as not only is it going to be dealing double damage based on the number of lands we actually get rid of, but also we have plenty of ways of getting these lands back anyways. So we're not too concerned about putting them in the bin. Keep in mind that we also have plenty of ways of cantripping and digging through the rest of our library, so we're gonna be finding these lands anyways. Match up Borborygmos with something like Riel the Everwise, and you're actually just self-wheeling almost every time you attack. But again, we don't really mind getting rid of our lands. We have plenty of discard outlets like Monument to Endurance and Glinthor Buccaneer that want to be discarded. We have cards like Bonnie Paul that allow us to get these lands back whenever we attack, as well as World Shaper, Aftermath Analyst, and Lumra. And we have delve cards like Murktide Regent, Treasure Cruise, and Dig Through Time in order to utilize any of these cards to help pay for their mana cost. Now, what is the actual goal of this deck? Well, it is still a commander creature-based strategy. So the entire goal is to flood the board with creatures, in which we have 38 of them, and utilize these creatures into the battlefield effects and attack triggers as best as possible to slowly whittle down our opponents over time. And then usually around turn 7 or 8, when the game is starting to wrap up, it's time to play some of our mini bombs. Those being cards like Bonnie Paul, Lumra, Morog, Itali Primal Conqueror, and Murktide Regent. We also have a really fun card in Rumbleweed, which can end up being quite cheap based on the amount of lands that you end up binning in the graveyard. So our game plan is to flood the board with early, cheap creatures that allow us to dig through our entire deck. All of these cards allow us to not only have power on board that can continuously swing, but allow us to dig through to find even more of our payoffs. This deck is absolutely a Rube Goldberg machine, trying to utilize all of these really weird pieces in order to fit a greater whole. That whole being a graveyard strategy in Temur. Now, we still have plenty of interaction, plenty of mana sources, and plenty of payoffs. If you'd like to check out the deck in the description below, feel free to. The Considering tab has 100 cards in it, and the deck itself has another 100 cards in it if you are looking to see how much this deck has gone through. This deck has quite the interesting play pattern, but I've had a blast trying it out. This deck is anything but simple, but it goes to show that just because a simple archetype is typically in one color, it does not always have to be in that color. At the beginning of the video, I asked, what do you think when you think of graveyard strategies? In most cases, they do have a particular play pattern, and the goal of this deck was to change that narrative. Graveyard does not have to be a simple, boring reanimation deck over and over and over again. Graveyard decks can simply be something that utilizes the graveyard to its fullest effect. And I think this deck does exactly that. So go check it out. Go roast me in the comments for cards that I have clearly missed in a strategy like this. And go check out that Considering and show me a version that you have built yourself. I like it a lot because this commander is quite silly, but I also like it because I think the play patterns itself are very interesting to watch and to try out. Again, if you would like to see this deck for yourself, it is supposed to be a bracket 2 deck that you can easily bring to any pod of Commander. Can it fit in with bracket 4? Probably not, but bracket 2 and 3 are going to be a great place for this deck to thrive in. Have you ever built a deck like this that is following a certain strategy, but is not the typical way the strategy is followed? I would 100% consider this a graveyard deck, but when you look at it, it doesn't look like a stereotypical graveyard deck. So let me know in the comments below if you've ever done something like this. Something that does follow the archetype's general values, but does it in a different way. Besides all that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys all have a great day. I'll see you next time.